Commander Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the military base's training ground, watching the morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete. The familiar weight of her dress uniform felt heavier today, not because of the fabric, but because of what lay ahead. In 3 hours, she would face the most challenging moment of her military career, and it wasn't on a battlefield. The email had arrived 2 weeks ago, crisp and formal like all military correspondence. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were conducting a comprehensive review of combat effectiveness across all branches. As one of the Navy's most decorated female officers, Sarah had been selected to present her service record before a panel of high-ranking officials from every branch of the military. It should have been an honor, but Sarah knew better. General Marcus Harrison would be on that panel. Sarah had heard the whispers about Harrison long before she'd ever met him. The Marine Corps legend had built his reputation on two things: his undeniable tactical brilliance and his equally undeniable belief that women had no place in combat roles. Despite official policy changes over the years, Harrison had never hidden his disdain for what he called political correctness in uniform. Walking back toward the base's main building, Sarah's mind drifted to the conversation she'd had with her mentor, Admiral Rebecca Torres, just the night before. Torres had been one of the first women to break through the Navy's glass ceiling, and her advice had always been invaluable. "Sarah," Torres had said over coffee in her office, "I won't lie to you. Harrison is going to try to tear you apart tomorrow. He's done it before with other female officers. The man believes that questioning our qualifications is some kind of patriotic duty." Sarah had stirred her coffee slowly, processing the warning. "What exactly should I expect? He'll go after your combat record first. Despite everything you've accomplished, he'll find ways to minimize it. He'll suggest that your medals were given for political reasons, that your men didn't really respect you, that you were protected because of your gender." Torres's voice had carried the weight of personal experience. "The worst part is that he's smart about it. He never says anything directly actionable, but he plants seeds of doubt." Now, as Sarah approached the briefing room where the panel would convene, those words echoed in her mind. She had spent the early morning hours reviewing her service record, not because she didn't know it by heart, but because she needed to remember why she had earned every single commendation. 7 years in active combat zones, 3 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart from the incident in Kandahar that still gave her nightmares, the Navy Cross for actions that had saved 17 lives during a mission gone wrong in Syria. Each medal represented moments when training, instinct, and pure determination had meant the difference between life and death, not just for herself, but for the sailors and Marines under her command. The hallway leading to the briefing room was longer than Sarah remembered from previous meetings. Her footsteps echoed against the polished floors, a steady rhythm that helped calm her nerves. She had faced enemy fire without flinching, had made split-second decisions that affected dozens of lives, had led men and women through situations that would break most people. Yet somehow, the thought of facing General Harrison's skepticism felt more daunting than any battlefield. As she neared the door, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in the glass. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture straight, her expression composed. But she could see something else in her eyes, a flicker of the doubt that Harrison would undoubtedly try to exploit. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath and forcing herself to remember who she was and what she had accomplished. The briefing room door opened, and Colonel James Peterson emerged. Sarah had served with Peterson in Afghanistan, and his presence on the panel was one of the few things that gave her comfort about the upcoming ordeal. "Sarah," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard, "I wanted to catch you before you went in there. I'm not supposed to say this, but Harrison's been asking pointed questions about your record for the past week. He's been digging into mission reports, talking to people who served with you." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest he's not looking for evidence of your competence, but for ammunition to use against it." Peterson's expression was grim. "He's been particularly interested in the Syria mission, the one that earned you the Navy Cross." The Syria mission. Sarah's jaw tightened as memories flooded back. It had been a routine intelligence gathering operation that had gone catastrophically wrong when their position was compromised. Surrounded and outnumbered, with wounded Marines and no clear evacuation route, Sarah had made the decision to lead a desperate counterattack that had broken the enemy's position and allowed for a successful extraction. It was the kind of quick thinking and decisive action that military leaders were supposed to exemplify. But Sarah knew that in Harrison's hands, even her greatest triumph could be twisted into something suspect. "Has he found anything?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Her record was impeccable because her service had been impeccable. Peterson shook his head. "That's what makes this so frustrating. Every person he's talked to has nothing but praise for your leadership. Your former commanding officers, the Marines who served under you, even the wounded who you helped evacuate, they all tell the same story. You're one of the finest officers they've ever worked with." "Then what's his angle?" "I think he's planning to attack the decisions that led to you being in combat positions in the first place. He can't question your performance, so he's going to question whether you should have been there at all." The briefing room door opened again, and a young ensign stepped out. "Commander Mitchell, they're ready for you now." Sarah nodded, straightening her shoulders. As she moved toward the door, Peterson caught her arm gently. "Sarah, remember that you've earned every right to be in that room. Don't let him make you forget that." The briefing room was exactly as Sarah had expected, a long conference table surrounded by chairs, with the American flag and various service flags positioned behind the head of the table. 5 officers sat along one side of the table, representing each branch of the military. At the center, his silver hair perfectly styled and his Marine dress uniform adorned with enough ribbons to tell the story of a distinguished career, sat General Marcus Harrison. Harrison was smaller than Sarah had expected, but there was an intensity to his gaze that immediately commanded attention. His eyes found hers the moment she entered the room, and she could see the assessment beginning immediately. This was a man accustomed to intimidating people, and he had clearly decided that she would be no exception. "Commander Mitchell," said Admiral Torres, who was chairing the panel, "thank you for joining us today. Please take a seat." Sarah settled into the chair facing the panel, placing her service record folder on the table in front of her. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the distant sounds of base activity filtering through the windows. "Commander," Admiral Torres began, "as you know, we're conducting a comprehensive review of combat leadership effectiveness across all services. Your record has been selected as exemplary of modern naval combat leadership. We'd like you to walk us through your most significant combat commands, focusing particularly on leadership decisions and their outcomes." Sarah had prepared for this moment extensively. She began with her first combat deployment, describing the challenges of leading a mixed unit of sailors and Marines in the complex urban environment of Iraq. She spoke clearly and confidently about tactical decisions, personnel management, and the delicate balance of aggression and restraint required in modern warfare. For the first 20 minutes, the questions were straightforward, professional, and respectful. Admiral Torres asked about training methodologies. The Army general wanted to know about inter-service cooperation. Even Harrison remained silent, simply listening and occasionally making notes. Then, Harrison leaned forward slightly, and Sarah felt the atmosphere in the room shift. "Commander Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, "I've been reviewing your service record with great interest, particularly your combat assignments. I have to say, I find myself curious about the decision-making process that placed you in direct combat roles." "Here it comes," Sarah thought. She kept her expression neutral and waited for him to continue. "Now, I'm not questioning your courage or your dedication," Harrison continued, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I am interested in understanding how a naval officer found herself leading Marine ground units in sustained combat operations. That seems unusual." Sarah had expected this line of questioning. "Sir, my assignments were made based on operational needs and my qualifications. In modern integrated operations, the lines between service branches are often blurred. My expertise in intelligence and logistics made me a natural choice for joint operations." Harrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, yes, intelligence and logistics, support roles. Yet according to your record, you found yourself in quite a bit of direct combat, almost as if you were seeking it out." The implication was clear, and Sarah felt a flash of anger that she quickly suppressed. "Sir, I went where I was ordered to go and did what the mission required. I never sought out combat, but I never ran from it either." "Of course not," Harrison said smoothly. "I'm sure you performed adequately. But I have to wonder about the wisdom of placing officers in positions where their physical limitations might compromise mission effectiveness." The room went deadly quiet. Sarah could feel the other panel members shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Even Admiral Torres looked taken aback by the directness of Harrison's challenge. Sarah had prepared for this moment, but hearing the words spoken aloud still hit like a physical blow. This was the core of Harrison's belief, that women were inherently inferior soldiers, that their presence in combat was a dangerous indulgence that put real warriors at risk. "General," Sarah said carefully, "I'm not sure I understand what physical limitations you're referring to. My fitness evaluations have consistently been in the top percentile, and I've never failed to complete any assigned mission." Harrison leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "Commander, let's not pretend that men and women are physically identical. The average male Marine can carry more, run faster, and hit harder than the average female officer. That's not prejudice, it's biology. Now, I'm not saying you're not brave. I'm sure you are. But bravery doesn't make up for physical reality." Sarah felt the weight of every female service member who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every woman who had ever worn the uniform and been told she wasn't good enough. "General Harrison," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion building inside her. "With respect, you seem to be confusing average statistics with individual capability. I didn't earn my position based on averages. I earned it through demonstrated performance in combat situations." "Did you?" Harrison's voice carried a note of skepticism that made Sarah's skin crawl. But did you earn it through a military that's more concerned with political correctness than combat effectiveness? Tell me, Commander, in your honest assessment, do you think your male colleagues see you as an equal or as someone they need to protect? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah could see the other panel members watching her reaction carefully. This was the moment Harrison had been building toward, the moment where he could plant the seed of doubt that would undermine everything she had accomplished. But as Sarah looked at Harrison's confident smirk, something shifted inside her. The doubt and anxiety that had plagued her all morning suddenly crystallized into something much more powerful: determination. She thought about the Marines who had followed her through enemy fire, the sailors who had trusted her with their lives, the missions that had succeeded because she had been there to lead them. Harrison thought he could diminish her accomplishments with his prejudices and assumptions. He thought he could make her question her own worth with carefully worded implications and knowing looks. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. Sarah straightened in her chair, meeting Harrison's gaze directly. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove. "General Harrison," she said, "I think there's something you need to understand about respect in combat." The silence that followed Sarah's words was thick with anticipation. General Harrison's smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a look of curious attention. He had expected her to become defensive, to stumble over statistics or appeal to policy. Instead, she had shifted the conversation to something much more dangerous for his position: actual combat experience. "General," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "you asked whether my colleagues see me as an equal or as someone they need to protect. Let me tell you about Sergeant Rodriguez." Sarah's mind traveled back to a dusty outpost in Afghanistan, where the morning heat was already oppressive at 7 a.m. She had been leading a joint Navy-Marine intelligence unit, tasked with identifying and neutralizing an insurgent cell that had been targeting supply convoys. Rodriguez was a Marine sniper, 10 years in service, 2 tours in Iraq before Afghanistan. 6'3", about 220 pounds of pure muscle. The kind of Marine who could bench press a small car and probably had at some point. Sarah could see she had Harrison's attention now, and the attention of everyone else in the room. "On our 3rd week in country, we received intelligence about a high-value target hiding in a compound about 12 kilometers from our base." The memory was as clear as if it had happened yesterday. Sarah could still smell the diesel fuel from the trucks, still feel the weight of her gear, still see the way Rodriguez had looked at her when she'd outlined the mission plan. The compound was in a valley surrounded by hills, natural defensive positions that made a direct assault extremely risky. Command wanted us to wait for air support, but intelligence indicated the target would be moved within 24 hours. I made the decision to proceed with a reconnaissance mission that could turn into a direct action if the opportunity presented itself. Harrison leaned forward slightly. Despite his prejudices, he was still a soldier, and soldiers were always interested in tactical problems and their solutions. Rodriguez questioned my decision, Sarah continued. Not my authority. He never did that, but the tactical wisdom of the approach. He thought we should wait for the air support, establish a proper perimeter, do it by the book. He was probably right from a pure risk management perspective. Sarah paused, letting the admission settle. She wasn't going to pretend she had been perfect because perfection wasn't what leadership was about. But I had information Rodriguez didn't have. Intelligence had indicated that the target was planning an attack on a school in a nearby village. Not a military target, a school full of children. Waiting for air support meant giving him the opportunity to carry out that attack. The room was completely silent now. Even Harrison had stopped taking notes. So I explained the situation to my team, including Rodriguez. I told them why I believe we needed to move immediately, and I gave them the choice. Military necessity didn't require me to ask for their input, but leadership sometimes means trusting your people with the truth and asking them to trust you with their lives. Sarah's voice grew quieter, more intense. Rodriguez was the first one to volunteer for the mission. Not because he thought I needed protection, General, but because he trusted my judgment. Because in the 3 weeks we'd served together, I'd proven that I made good decisions under pressure. Harrison's expression had changed subtly. The smug confidence was still there, but it was mixed with something else now. Professional interest in spite of himself. The mission went sideways about half an hour in, Sarah continued. We had approached the compound using a route that should have been clear, but intelligence had missed a patrol that was running in a regular schedule. We found ourselves caught between the patrol and the compound with limited cover and no clear route of retreat. This was the part of the story that still gave Sarah nightmares. Not because it had been terrifying, but because it had been the moment when everything she had been trained for was put to the ultimate test. Rodriguez was positioned about 50 meters to my right, providing overwatch while I led the main team toward the compound. When the patrol surprised us, we were exposed in open ground. The first burst of gunfire caught Corpsman Jenkins in the leg. Not life-threatening, but enough to slow us down significantly. Sarah could still hear the sharp crack of the rifle rounds, still feel the adrenaline surge that had made everything seem to slow down and speed up at the same time. I had two choices: order an immediate retreat and lose our chance at the target, or press the attack and risk getting my people killed in a firefight we weren't prepared for. Either way, people were going to die, either my team or the children in that school. Harrison was listening intently now, his earlier smugness replaced by the focused attention of a professional soldier hearing about a tactical problem he could relate to. I chose to attack. I split my team into 2 groups, one to suppress the patrol, one to take the compound. I led the compound assault myself, while Rodriguez provided precision fire support against the patrol. It was the kind of decision that gets you court-martialed if it goes wrong and decorated if it goes right. Sarah paused, remembering the weight of that decision, the knowledge that she was gambling with lives based on her assessment of an impossible situation. Rodriguez never hesitated. When I called for covering fire, he delivered it. When I needed him to shift position to get a better angle on the compound, he moved without question. When Corpsman Jenkins went down, and I ordered Rodriguez to help with the evacuation while maintaining his overwatch position, he found a way to do both. The memory of Rodriguez's calm professionalism under fire still filled Sarah with admiration. He had been everything a Marine was supposed to be: adaptable, decisive, absolutely reliable when everything was falling apart. General, you asked whether my men saw me as someone they needed to protect. Let me tell you what Rodriguez told me after that mission, when we were back at base and the adrenaline had worn off. Sarah's voice took on the slight, gravelly tone of a Marine sergeant. Ma'am, I've served under a lot of officers, and most of them would have gotten us killed today. Either they would have been too scared to make the hard call, or too stubborn to adapt when the situation changed. You kept us alive and completed the mission because you're a good officer. Not a good female officer, just a good officer. The words hung in the air, carrying the weight of professional respect earned under the worst possible circumstances. Sarah could see that Harrison was processing the story, trying to find holes in it or ways to diminish its impact. That's a nice story, Commander, Harrison said finally, but it doesn't address the fundamental issue. Perhaps Sergeant Rodriguez was simply being polite. Military culture discourages criticism of superior officers. Sarah had expected this response. Harrison was too experienced to be completely swayed by one story. no matter how compelling. He would need more. You're absolutely right, General. Military courtesy can certainly mask true opinions, which is why I think you should know what Rodriguez said about me to his wife. Sarah reached into her folder and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is a letter Rodriguez wrote to his wife 3 days after that mission. His widow gave me a copy after he was killed in action 6 months later. With your permission, I'd like to read just one part. Admiral Torres nodded, and Sarah unfolded the letter. The paper was slightly worn, as if it had been read many times. Maria, Sarah began, reading in a clear voice, I know you worry about me over here, and I know you especially worry about some of the officers we serve under. I wanted you to know that Commander Mitchell is the kind of officer you hope to serve under, but rarely get the chance to. Today she made decisions that saved lives and completed a mission that could have saved even more lives. She's smart, she's brave, and most importantly, she thinks about her people first and her career second. I would follow her into any fight, anywhere. Sarah folded the letter and placed it back in her folder. Rodriguez didn't write those words for my benefit, General. He wrote them for his wife, in a private letter where he had no reason to be anything other than completely honest. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly. The letter was powerful evidence, and Sarah could see him searching for ways to counter it. One soldier's opinion, Harrison began. I have 17 more letters, General, Sarah interrupted quietly, from Marines, sailors, and soldiers who serve under my command, all written to family members, all expressing similar sentiments. I also have after-action reports from 7 different commanding officers who evaluated my performance in combat situations. Sarah pulled out another folder, this one thick with documents. Would you like me to read from Colonel Patterson's evaluation of my performance during the Syria operation? The one where he recommended me for the Navy Cross. Harrison's expression darkened. He clearly hadn't expected Sarah to come this prepared, this willing to present evidence that directly contradicted his assumptions about her capabilities and her relationships with the men under her command. Colonel Patterson wrote that my actions during the Syria operation demonstrated exceptional tactical thinking, decisive leadership under extreme pressure, and the kind of personal courage that inspires others to achieve beyond their normal capabilities. He specifically noted that the Marines under my command performed at levels that exceeded their previous combat effectiveness ratings. Sarah set the folder down and looked directly at Harrison. General, I understand your concerns about physical capabilities. I understand that the average woman is not as physically strong as the average man. But I'm not the average woman, and my Marines weren't the average Marines. We were specific individuals in specific situations, performing specific missions. The room was completely quiet. Sarah could feel the attention of every person present focused entirely on her words. When Rodriguez needed covering fire during that mission in Afghanistan, he didn't care whether I could bench press as much as he could. He cared whether I could accurately place rifle fire where he needed it, when he needed it. When Corpsman Jenkins was wounded and needed to be evacuated, my team didn't care whether I could carry him 3 kilometers by myself. They cared whether I could organize an effective evacuation under fire while maintaining tactical coherence. Sarah's voice grew stronger, more confident. And when we were trapped in that compound in Syria, surrounded by enemy fighters and running low on ammunition, my Marines didn't follow me because military courtesy required it. They followed me because they trusted that I would make the decisions most likely to get them home alive. Harrison was beginning to look uncomfortable, but Sarah wasn't finished. She had spent too many years listening to officers like him question her qualifications based on their prejudices rather than her performance. Today, that was going to end. General Harrison, you've spent this entire conversation talking about averages and assumptions. You question my fitness, my capabilities, and my relationships with the men under my command. But you haven't asked me about the one thing that actually matters in combat leadership. Sarah paused, letting the question build tension in the room. You haven't asked me about results. The word results hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down at Harrison's feet. Sarah could see the general's expression shift as he realized that the conversation had moved beyond his comfort zone of theoretical arguments and into the much more dangerous territory of measurable performance. Results, Sarah repeated, her voice steady and clear. In 7 years of combat operations, every mission I commanded achieved its primary objectives. Every single one. 0 mission failures under my command. Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly. Commander, mission success rates can be influenced by many factors. You're absolutely right, Sarah interrupted, pulling out yet another folder. Mission success can depend on intelligence quality, resource availability, weather conditions, enemy capabilities, and dozens of other variables outside the commanding officer's control. Which is why I think you should hear about the Syria operation from someone other than me. Sarah opened the folder and removed a digital tablet. This is a recorded statement from Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, no relation to Admiral Torres. He was the senior non-commissioned officer on the Syria mission. He gave this statement to Marine Corps investigators as part of the official after-action review. Admiral Torres leaned forward slightly. Commander, I'm not sure recorded testimony is. With respect, Admiral, General Harrison has questioned my credibility and the credibility of my written records. Perhaps hearing from Gunnery Sergeant Torres directly will provide the perspective he's looking for. Sarah activated the tablet, and a voice filled the room, gravelly, matter-of-fact, with the unmistakable cadence of a career Marine. This is Gunnery Sergeant Michael Torres, United States Marine Corps, Service Number 265-1987. I am providing this statement regarding the combat operations conducted in Syria under the command of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy. Harrison's jaw tightened as the recording continued. This was clearly not what he had expected from the morning's proceedings. On the date in question, our unit was conducting a reconnaissance mission in hostile territory when we were engaged by a superior enemy force. Our position was compromised, we had wounded personnel, and our primary extraction route had been cut off by enemy movement. The Marine's voice was clinical, professional, but Sarah could hear the underlying emotion, the kind of controlled intensity that came from remembering moments when death had been a very real possibility. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell assessed the situation and made the decision to conduct an immediate counterattack rather than attempt to hold our position for reinforcements. This was contrary to standard doctrine, which would have called for a defensive posture pending air support. Sarah watched Harrison's face carefully. She could see him processing the information, probably running through his own tactical analysis of the situation. The commander's decision appeared tactically unsound at first. We were outnumbered approximately 3-1. We had wounded personnel who would be difficult to maneuver with, and we would be attacking an enemy force that had superior positioning. Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, and Sarah could see a hint of vindication in his expression. Here, finally, was evidence that her decisions had been questionable. But Gunnery Sergeant Torres wasn't finished. However, the commander had identified something the rest of us had missed. The enemy force had positioned themselves in a way that created a natural bottleneck. If we could break their line at the right point, we could not only escape, but potentially inflict significant casualties on a numerically superior force. The recording paused for a moment, and Torres's voice took on a different tone when it resumed, one of professional admiration. The commander explained her tactical assessment to the senior NCOs and asked for our input. She didn't have to do that. The decision was hers to make, but she wanted to ensure we understood her reasoning before committing to what was essentially a desperate gamble. Sarah could see Harrison's expression changing again. This wasn't the story of a reckless officer making emotional decisions. This was the story of a leader who had seen an opportunity that others had missed and had the courage to act on it. I have served under 47 different officers in my 22 years in the Corps, Torres continued. I have never seen a more precise tactical analysis conducted under extreme pressure. The commander identified the enemy's weakness, developed a plan to exploit it, and communicated that plan clearly enough that every Marine knew exactly what his role would be. The room was completely silent except for the Marine's recorded voice. The counterattack succeeded beyond our most optimistic projections. We broke the enemy line, inflicted heavy casualties, and evacuated all personnel, including our wounded. Mission success was achieved with 0 friendly casualties beyond the initial wounded. Sarah paused the recording and looked directly at Harrison. General, Gunnery Sergeant Torres was awarded the Silver Star for his actions during that mission. He could have commanded that operation himself if he had been an officer. His tactical expertise is acknowledged throughout the Marine Corps. When he says my analysis was superior to any he had seen in 22 years of service, I think his opinion carries some weight. Harrison was quiet for several seconds, clearly processing what he had heard. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying less certainty than it had earlier. Commander, I'm not questioning the success of that particular mission. But one successful operation, even a dramatically successful one, doesn't necessarily indicate. You're right again, General, Sarah said, cutting him off with a smile that was anything but submissive. One mission proves nothing, which is why I'd like to tell you about my casualty rates. Sarah pulled out another document, this one a detailed statistical analysis. Over 7 years of combat command, encompassing 43 separate operations involving direct combat, my unit sustained a casualty rate of 2.3%. The average casualty rate for comparable operations conducted by other commanders during the same period was 8.7%. The numbers hit the room like a physical force. Harrison's expression went completely blank as he processed the implications. 2.3%, Sarah repeated. That means that statistically speaking, serving under my command was nearly 4 times safer than serving under the average combat commander. Not the average female commander, General. The average commander, period. Sarah set the document down and leaned back slightly in her chair. Now, you might argue that I achieved those numbers by being overly cautious, by avoiding necessary risks, by prioritizing safety over mission accomplishment. That would be a reasonable assumption. Harrison nodded slightly, clearly grasping for that explanation. Except that during the same period, my units also had a mission success rate of 100% and a commendation rate, meaning individual decorations earned by personnel under my command, that was 340% above average. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could see Admiral Torres trying to hide a smile, while Colonel Peterson looked frankly amazed. So my Marines and sailors were nearly 4 times less likely to be killed or wounded and more than 3 times as likely to be recognized for exceptional performance. They accomplished every mission they were given, and they did it in a way that earned individual recognition for their efforts. Sarah's voice took on a harder edge. General Harrison, I'm curious about your explanation for those statistics. If women are inherently inferior combat leaders, if men don't respect female commanders, if political correctness has compromised military effectiveness, then how exactly do you account for my results? Harrison's face had gone pale. The confident, dismissive demeanor he had maintained throughout the morning was cracking visibly. There could be many explanations, he began, such as, perhaps you were given easier assignments. Perhaps your units were better equipped or better trained than average. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Those are reasonable possibilities. Let me address them. She pulled out yet another folder, and Harrison's expression suggested he was beginning to dread Sarah's seemingly endless supply of documentation. This is a comparative analysis of mission difficulty ratings, equipment availability, and personnel quality ratings for my commands versus other comparable units. The analysis was conducted by the Naval War College as part of a study on combat effectiveness. Sarah opened the folder and scanned the contents briefly. My units were assigned missions with an average difficulty rating of 7.2 on a 10-point scale. The average for all units in the study was 6.1. So I was consistently given more difficult assignments, not easier ones. Harrison's jaw was clenched so tightly that Sarah could see the muscles standing out. Equipment availability for my units averaged 87% of authorized levels. The average for all units was 92%. Personnel experience levels, measured by average time in service and previous combat deployments, were actually slightly below average for my commands. Sarah closed the folder and looked directly at Harrison. So I achieved superior results with less experienced personnel, less equipment, and more difficult missions. General, I'm genuinely curious about how you would explain that using your theory about female combat leadership. Harrison was silent for almost a full minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with barely controlled frustration. Statistics can be manipulated, Commander. Numbers don't tell the whole story. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. Numbers don't tell the whole story, which is why I'd like to share something that isn't in any official record. Sarah's demeanor changed slightly, becoming more personal, more emotional. General, you've spent this morning questioning my qualifications, my relationships with my troops, and my combat effectiveness. You've done everything possible to suggest that my success was somehow artificial, that it was the result of political correctness or special treatment or lowered standards. Her voice grew stronger. But there's something you need to understand about the men and women who served under my command. They didn't follow me because the military told them to. They didn't protect me because I was a woman who needed protection. They didn't succeed because I made their jobs easier. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving Harrison's face. They followed me, protected each other, and succeeded because I taught them that they were capable of more than they had ever imagined. Because I showed them that excellence wasn't about meeting minimum standards. It was about discovering what they could accomplish when someone believed in them completely. The room was electric with tension. Admiral Torres was leaning forward, completely absorbed. Colonel Peterson's expression suggested he was witnessing something historic. You want to know the real secret of my success, General? It has nothing to do with my gender and everything to do with my leadership philosophy. I never asked my Marines and sailors to protect me. I protected them. I never asked them to make allowances for my limitations. I showed them how to overcome their own limitations. Sarah's voice dropped to a near whisper, but every word carried clearly through the silent room. And when they saw what they could accomplish under that kind of leadership, they started protecting each other the way I protected them. They started believing in each other the way I believed in them. They became better Marines and sailors than they had ever been before, not because their standards were lowered, but because their potential was unleashed. Harrison was staring at her now, his earlier smugness completely gone, replaced by something that might have been respect, or might have been fear. General Harrison, Sarah said quietly, I think you've misunderstood something fundamental about what makes a good leader. You seem to think it's about being the strongest, or the fastest, or the most aggressive. But leadership isn't about being superior to your people. It's about making your people superior to what they were before. The silence stretched out for several seconds before Sarah delivered her final words with quiet confidence. And that, General, is something that has absolutely nothing to do with gender. The silence that followed Sarah's words was unlike anything she had ever experienced in a military briefing. It was the kind of silence that fell when something fundamental had shifted, when the entire dynamic of a room had been permanently altered. General Harrison sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his expression unreadable. Admiral Torres was the first to speak, her voice careful and measured. Commander Mitchell, your presentation has been comprehensive. Are there any other aspects of your service record you feel the panel should consider? Sarah remained standing, her posture straight but relaxed. The nervous energy that had plagued her all morning was gone, replaced by a calm confidence that came from having said everything that needed to be said. Actually, Admiral, there's one more thing. She reached into her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. This morning, General Harrison asked me whether I believed my male colleagues saw me as an equal or as someone they needed to protect. I presented statistical evidence of my effectiveness and testimonial evidence of my troops' confidence in my leadership. But there's one more perspective I think the panel should hear. Sarah held up the paper. This is a letter from Colonel David Martinez, United States Marine Corps, currently serving as commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Division. Colonel Martinez served as my executive officer during 3 separate deployments. Harrison looked up sharply. Martinez was a legendary figure in the Marine Corps, a warrior's warrior whose reputation was absolutely unassailable. If Martinez had negative things to say about Sarah's leadership, it would carry enormous weight. Colonel Martinez wrote this letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps last month, when he learned that my service record was being reviewed by this panel. He wrote it without my knowledge or permission, and I only learned about it yesterday. Sarah's voice took on a formal tone as she began to read. To the Commandant, United States Marine Corps. Sir, I am writing to provide my assessment of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy, with whom I have had the honor of serving in combat operations. The formality of the opening suggested that Martinez had intended this letter to carry the weight of an official recommendation. In military culture, such letters were not written lightly. In 26 years of service, I have served under, alongside, and in command of hundreds of officers. I have observed leadership under every conceivable condition, from routine training to desperate combat situations. I have seen officers succeed brilliantly and fail catastrophically. I write to you today to state unequivocally that Lieutenant Commander Mitchell is the finest combat leader I have ever had the privilege to serve with. Harrison's expression had gone completely blank. Martinez's opinion carried the kind of weight that could make or break careers, and his words were an endorsement that no one could question. This assessment is not based on sympathy, political correctness, or any desire to promote social engineering within the military. It is based on observed performance under conditions where failure would have resulted in the deaths of Marines under our command. Sarah paused, letting Martinez's words sink in. The colonel had anticipated exactly the kind of skepticism Harrison had been expressing, and his letter addressed it directly. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell possesses the three qualities that define exceptional combat leadership: tactical brilliance, personal courage, and the ability to inspire others to perform beyond their normal capabilities. More importantly, she possesses these qualities in combination, which is extraordinarily rare. Admiral Torres was listening intently, clearly recognizing the significance of Martinez's testimony. Colonel Peterson was nodding slightly, as if Martinez's words confirmed his own observations. I have seen Lieutenant Commander Mitchell analyze complex tactical situations and identify solutions that escaped other experienced officers, including myself. I have seen her maintain perfect composure under fire while making decisions that affected the lives of dozens of personnel. Most importantly, I have seen her transform average Marines into exceptional ones through the simple expedient of expecting excellence from them and showing them how to achieve it. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued reading. Sir, there has been considerable discussion in recent years about the role of women in combat positions. I submit that this discussion is largely irrelevant when applied to Lieutenant Commander Mitchell. She is not a good female officer or an effective woman leader. She is simply the best combat commander I have ever served with, period. The room was completely still. Harrison was staring at the table in front of him. His earlier confidence entirely evaporated. If forced to choose between Lieutenant Commander Mitchell and any other officer I have known to lead my Marines into combat, I would choose her without hesitation. Any Marine would be lucky to serve under her command, and any officer would be fortunate to serve alongside her. Sarah folded the letter and placed it back in her folder. Colonel Martinez concluded his letter by requesting that it be placed in my permanent service record as his official assessment of my combat leadership capabilities. The Commandant approved that request. She sat back down slowly, her presentation complete. The morning had been a marathon, an exhaustive presentation of evidence that had systematically dismantled every assumption Harrison had brought into the room. General Harrison sat in silence for several minutes, clearly struggling with how to respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was much quieter than it had been earlier. Commander Mitchell, he began, then paused, seeming to search for the right words. I came into this meeting with certain preconceptions about female combat leadership. I believe those preconceptions were based on legitimate concerns about military effectiveness. Harrison looked directly at Sarah for the first time since her presentation had begun. Your record suggests that my concerns may have been misplaced. It was not quite an apology, but it was as close to an admission of error as someone like Harrison was likely to make in front of a panel of his peers. Admiral Torres leaned forward slightly. General, do you have any other questions for Commander Mitchell regarding her combat leadership experience? Harrison shook his head slowly. No, I admitted. I believe the commander has answered all of my questions quite thoroughly. Colonel Peterson cleared his throat. Commander Mitchell, I have a question that's somewhat different from what we've been discussing. Sarah nodded, prepared for whatever might come next. You've presented overwhelming evidence of your effectiveness as a combat leader. Your statistics are impressive, your testimonials are powerful, and your tactical decisions appear to have been consistently sound. But I'm curious about something else. Peterson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. How do you respond to officers like General Harrison who question your qualifications based on your gender? How do you handle that kind of skepticism from colleagues? The question was clearly designed to probe how Sarah dealt with the ongoing challenges she faced as a female officer in a traditionally male-dominated field. It was a fair question, and one that had obvious relevance to her effectiveness in joint operations. Sarah considered her answer carefully. Colonel, I found that there are generally two types of officers who express skepticism about female combat leadership. The first type has legitimate concerns based on their experience and training. They're worried about unit cohesion, about physical capabilities, about the practical challenges of integrating women into combat roles. She gestured slightly toward Harrison. General Harrison, despite our disagreement this morning, falls into that category. His concerns come from a genuine desire to maintain military effectiveness, and he's willing to examine evidence that challenges his assumptions. Harrison's expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure whether Sarah had just complimented or criticized him. The second type of skeptical officer is different. They're not really concerned about military effectiveness. They're concerned about change, about challenges to their worldview, about maintaining traditional power structures. Evidence doesn't matter to them because their opposition isn't based on evidence. Sarah's voice became more direct. With the first type of officer, I respond exactly as I did this morning. I present evidence, I demonstrate competence, and I earn respect through performance. With the second type, I don't waste my time trying to convince them. I focus on doing my job well enough that their opinion becomes irrelevant. Peterson nodded thoughtfully. And how do you distinguish between the two types? It's usually pretty easy, Colonel. The first type asks questions about your capabilities. The second type makes statements about your limitations. A slight smile crossed Peterson's face. That's a useful distinction, Commander. Admiral Torres looked around the table at her fellow panel members. Are there any other questions for Commander Mitchell? The other officers shook their heads. The morning session had been far more comprehensive than anyone had anticipated. Commander Mitchell, Torres said formally, thank you for your presentation today. Your service record speaks for itself, and your responses to our questions have been both thorough and professional. This panel will prepare a formal assessment of your combat leadership capabilities for inclusion in your service record. Sarah stood and gathered her materials. Thank you, Admiral. It's been an honor to serve with distinction, and I look forward to continuing that service. As Sarah moved toward the door, Harrison's voice stopped her. Commander. Sarah turned back to face him. Harrison had stood as well, his expression serious but no longer hostile. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. I came into this meeting with assumptions that were not supported by facts. Your record speaks for itself, and I was wrong to question it based on anything other than performance. The apology was formal, military in its precision, but Sarah could hear the sincerity behind it. Thank you, General. I appreciate that. Harrison nodded once, a sharp military gesture of acknowledgement. I would be honored to serve alongside you, Commander. Sarah returned the nod and left the room, closing the door quietly behind her. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for a moment, allowing herself to fully process what had just happened. She had not merely defended her record. She had fundamentally challenged the assumptions that had been used to question female combat leadership for generations. She had done it not through anger or emotion, but through the simple presentation of irrefutable evidence. But as Sarah walked down the hall toward her office, she knew that the morning's victory was about more than just her own career. It was about every woman who had ever been told she wasn't strong enough, smart enough, or tough enough to lead in combat. It was about changing perceptions one presentation, one mission, one successful command at a time. The real test would come not in briefing rooms, but on future battlefields, where her words would be measured against results. But Sarah was confident in that test. She had been preparing for it her entire career. As she reached her office, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from Admiral Torres. Outstanding presentation. Recommend immediate consideration for promotion to captain. Full panel endorsement. Sarah smiled and put the phone away. The morning had gone better than she had dared to hope. But more importantly, it had ended a certain type of conversation about female combat leadership, at least within the small but influential circle of officers who had witnessed it. Change happened one mind at a time, one conversation at a time, one successful mission at a time. Today had been a good start. 6 months after the panel hearing, Commander Sarah Mitchell found herself standing on the deck of the USS Constellation, watching the Mediterranean sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The promotion to captain had come through 3 weeks earlier, along with orders to take command of a joint task force responsible for counterterrorism operations in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was the kind of assignment that typically went to officers with impeccable political connections and absolutely spotless records. Sarah had both, but she also had something more valuable: a reputation for getting impossible jobs done with minimal casualties and maximum effectiveness. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, General Harrison had questioned whether she should be in combat positions at all. Now she was commanding a task force that included Marine units under Harrison's ultimate command structure. Captain Mitchell. Sarah turned to see Lieutenant Commander James Park approaching. Park was her new executive officer, a brilliant young officer who had specifically requested assignment to her command after hearing about the panel hearing. Word had spread through the Navy with the kind of speed that suggested the story had struck a nerve. Yes, Commander. Ma'am, we've received updated intelligence on the target package. The situation has developed some complications. Sarah nodded and followed Park to the ship's command center. The mission they were planning was exactly the kind of complex, high-risk operation that had defined her career, a hostage rescue in a hostile urban environment, with minimal time for preparation and maximum consequences for failure. "What's the latest?" Sarah asked as they entered the bustling command center. Park activated the main display screen, which showed satellite imagery of a coastal city. "Intelligence now indicates that the hostages have been moved to this location," he said, pointing to a building near the city center. "The problem is that the new location is much more heavily defended than the original target." Sarah studied the imagery carefully. The building was a fortress surrounded by multiple defensive positions and with limited approach routes. It was the kind of target that would normally require weeks of planning and significant air support. "Timeline?" she asked. 12 hours. "Intelligence indicates the hostages will be moved again tomorrow morning, probably to a location where rescue will be impossible." Sarah nodded grimly. 12 hours to plan and execute a mission that should take weeks to prepare properly. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation she had faced throughout her career. "What assets do we have available?" Park pulled up a list on a secondary display. 2 platoons of Marines, 1 SEAL team, helicopter support, and limited air cover. The Marine platoons are from the 2nd Division. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. The 2nd Division was Colonel Martinez's command. There was a good chance some of the Marines she'd be working with had served under her before. "Who's the senior Marine NCO?" "Gunnery Sedentov." "Mom." Sarah paused, processing the name. It wasn't the same Rodriguez who had been killed in Afghanistan, but the coincidence still gave her a moment of reflection about the cycles of military service and the weight of command responsibility. "Give me a briefing with all unit commanders in 30 minutes, Sarah ordered. "And Commander Park?" "Make sure Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez knows I want his assessment of the target before we finalize any plans." As Park moved to carry out her orders, Sarah remained in the command center, studying the intelligence reports and satellite imagery. The rescue mission was going to require the kind of precise coordination and split-second timing that could only be achieved by a team that trusted each other completely. 30 minutes later, Sarah faced a room full of officers and senior non-commissioned officers representing every element of her task force. At the back of the room, she spotted Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, a compact, weathered Marine with the kind of calm intensity that marked career infantry leaders. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, "we have 12 hours to plan and execute a hostage rescue mission against a heavily defended target. Intelligence indicates that delay is not an option, and failure is not acceptable." She activated the display, showing the target building. "The good news is that we have some of the finest personnel in the military for this type of operation. The bad news is that this is going to require absolutely perfect execution with minimal margin for error." Sarah spent the next 20 minutes outlining the intelligence picture and the constraints they were operating under. When she finished, she opened the floor for questions and suggestions. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez was the first to speak. "Ma'am, I've been looking at the approach routes, and I think there's an option intelligence might have missed." Sarah nodded for him to continue. "The building has a service tunnel system that connects to the city's old water management infrastructure. It's not on any of the current maps, but some of my Marines worked in this area 2 years ago. If the tunnels are still accessible, we might be able to approach from underground." It was exactly the kind of local knowledge that could make the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sarah had learned long ago that the best intelligence often came from troops who had actually been on the ground. "How confident are you about the tunnel access?" she asked. Rodriguez considered carefully. 70%, ma'am. But if I'm right, it changes everything about how we approach this target." Sarah looked around the room at her officers. "Thoughts?" The SEAL team leader leaned forward. "If Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez is right, we could position the primary assault team much closer to the objective before the operation begins. That reduces exposure time and increases our chances of achieving surprise." The helicopter squadron commander nodded agreement. "It would also allow us to position air assets for rapid extraction rather than having to use them for close support during the approach." Sarah could see the plan coming together in the minds of her team leaders. This was how good operations were born, through the combination of professional expertise, local knowledge, and creative problem-solving under pressure. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez, Sarah said. I want you to work with intelligence to confirm tunnel access. If you're right, you'll lead the advance team through the underground approach. Rodriguez nodded crisply. Aye aye, Mom. For the next 8 hours, Sarah's task force worked with the kind of focused intensity that she had come to associate with truly professional military units. Every detail was planned, rehearsed, and refined. Contingency plans were developed for dozens of potential complications. Equipment was checked, rechecked, and positioned for immediate deployment. At 0300 hours, Sarah stood in the ship's briefing room facing the assembled assault teams. In 4 hours, they would be inserting into hostile territory to attempt one of the most challenging missions in military operations, a precision hostage rescue against a heavily defended target. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah began, her voice carrying the calm authority that had become her trademark. In 4 hours, we're going to do something that most military analysts would say is impossible with our available resources and timeline. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each team leader. They're probably right. This mission is at the edge of what's operationally feasible. But impossible missions are what we train for, and impossible missions are what we've been successful at throughout our careers. Sarah's voice grew stronger. You've been selected for this task force because you're the best at what you do. Not the best available, not the best we could find on short notice. The best, period. And the best is exactly what this mission requires. She activated the display, showing the final mission plan. Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez was correct about the tunnel access. Intelligence has confirmed that we can approach the target building through the underground route. This gives us the element of surprise and significantly improves our odds of success. The room was completely silent, every person focused entirely on Sarah's words. But make no mistake, this is still an extremely high-risk operation. We're going to be operating in a hostile urban environment against an unknown number of enemy fighters. We have one chance to get this right, and the consequences of failure extend far beyond this mission. Sarah's voice took on a more personal tone. 6 months ago, I sat in a room with military leaders who questioned whether women belong in combat positions. They argued that female leadership compromised unit effectiveness and put lives at unnecessary risk. Several of the Marines in the room exchanged glances. The story of Sarah's confrontation with General Harrison had become something of a legend in certain military circles. Tomorrow morning, the success or failure of this mission will provide another data point in that ongoing debate. But, more importantly, tomorrow morning, 18 innocent people are counting on us to bring them home alive. Sarah straightened to her full height. We're going to succeed because we're professionals who have trained for exactly this type of mission. We're going to succeed because we trust each other and we communicate clearly. And we're going to succeed because failure is simply not an option. The briefing continued for another hour, covering final details and contingency procedures. When it was over, Sarah found herself alone with Gunnery Sergeant Rodriguez. Ma'am, Rodriguez said quietly, I wanted you to know that some of my Marines served under you in Afghanistan. They've been talking about this mission all week. Sarah raised an eyebrow. What have they been saying? Rodriguez smiled slightly. They've been telling the new Marines that they're lucky to be serving under your command for a mission like this. They said that following you into a fight was the safest place they'd ever been in a war zone. The comment hit Sarah harder than she had expected. After all the statistics and testimonials and official endorsements, hearing that her former Marines still trusted her with their lives was the validation that mattered most. Gunnery Sergeant, she said, make sure those Marines understand that trust is a two-way street. I'm counting on them to perform tomorrow the way they always have. Yes, ma'am. They won't let you down. For hours later, Sarah stood in the ship's command center, watching multiple video feeds as her task force moved toward the target. The underground approach had worked perfectly. Rodriguez's local knowledge had been exactly correct. The assault teams were in position, the helicopter support was standing by, and all intelligence indicators suggested they had achieved complete tactical surprise. All teams report ready, Commander Park announced. Sarah took a deep breath and activated the command frequency. All teams, this is Constellation Actual. Execute, execute, execute. On the video screens, Sarah watched her carefully planned operation unfold with textbook precision. The assault teams moved through the target building with speed and efficiency, neutralizing threats and locating hostages according to the timeline they had rehearsed. Within 18 minutes, all hostages had been located and secured. Enemy resistance had been minimal. The underground approach had achieved the surprise they had hoped for. Casualties were limited to minor injuries, and all objectives had been accomplished. Constellation Actual, this is ground team leader, came the voice of the SEAL team commander. All hostages secured, all teams accounted for. Mission success. Sarah felt the familiar surge of satisfaction that came with successful mission completion, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one more operation in an ongoing career. Tomorrow there would be new challenges, new impossible missions, new opportunities to prove that excellence had nothing to do with gender. As the extraction helicopters lifted off with the rescued hostages, Sarah's communication officer handed her a message that had just been received. Priority message from General Harrison, ma'am. Sarah opened the message and read, "Outstanding mission execution. Textbook example of joint operations effectiveness. Recommend your task force for unit commendation. Proud to have Marines serving under your command. Respectfully, Harrison." Sarah smiled and handed the message back to the communications officer. 6 months ago, General Harrison had questioned whether she belonged in combat. Today, he was recommending her unit for commendation and expressing pride in having his Marines under her command. Change happened one mission at a time, one successful operation at a time, one converted skeptic at a time. Today had been a very good day for change. As the USS Constellation headed back to base, Sarah stood once again on the deck, watching the Mediterranean sunrise replace the stars she had been watching 12 hours earlier. The cycle of military operations continued, but something fundamental had shifted. She was no longer proving that women could be effective combat leaders. She was simply being an effective combat leader who happened to be a woman. And that distinction, subtle as it might seem, represented a victory far more significant than any single mission success. The military was changing one mind at a time, one operation at a time. And Sarah Mitchell would continue to be part of that change, not as a symbol or a token, but as a professional who had earned her place through competence, courage, and results. The conversation about women in combat wasn't over, but the terms of that conversation had been permanently altered. Excellence, as Sarah had proven repeatedly, truly had nothing to do with gender. And that was a lesson the entire military was finally beginning to understand.